In this modern city where the lines between good and evil were often blurred, where the line between power and impunity seemed as shifting as the air we breathed, Maya Williams, a black FBI agent, was preparing for a discreet mission. She was not a flamboyant figure or an everyday heroine. Her presence did not attract attention, but it was precisely this discretion that made her an effective agent. At 34, Maya was already a veteran of the FBI, having joined the agency more than 5 years ago after spending years proving her worth in an environment where sexism and racism were often more prevalent than many would like to admit. As a black woman in a historically male-dominated institution, she did not have the luxury of kindness or alleviated doubts. Every file on her desk was an opportunity to show that she was up to it, that she deserved her place. And although she had never been naive about the reality of prejudices, she had learned to ignore them, to overcome them, like a river that diverts the flow of water without submitting to its force. Maya was not the type to let herself be defined by her origins, nor by the color of her skin. Yet she knew that in a system as complex as the FBI's, bias could be as invisible as it was devastating. Their shapes were sometimes subtle, sometimes blatant, but always present. She had felt it every time a colleague had doubted her abilities without even being aware of it, every time a door had closed behind her in a meeting room simply because she was not the ones expected. Each moment of this journey had forged her character, had made her stronger, but also more vigilant. She often found herself doing double duty, proving her technical skills as an agent while demonstrating that her status was not due to her color, but to her merit. His days were marked by the constant effort not to let himself be pigeonholed into a pre-established category. This, she knew, would always be her struggle. But she led this fight with quiet determination, seeking to change perceptions while accomplishing her mission with the rigor of a professional. That day, she was not in the field on a large-scale mission. It was not about tracking down an international criminal or thwarting a terrorist threat. No, his mission consisted of observing, recording data, discreetly following a target in a quiet residential area, where life seemed peaceful, almost unreal. The routine. But Maya loved these moments of observation, this silent time where we captured the smallest details. She knew that a small gesture, a lost look or a furtive shadow could sometimes be the beginning of the revelation of a big secret. She never underestimated the importance of each task, even if it was hidden in the shadows. His sharp gaze was just as important a tool as any weapon or technological gadget. She had everything going for her: patience, instinct, the ability to analyze and deduce. This observant tranquility was his domain. But this day would be no ordinary mission. As she prepared to leave the area for the end of her day, her attention was drawn to the familiar silhouette of a man who was quickly approaching her. Officer Lewis, an arrogant and impulsive local policeman, stepped into the street. He was not a simple agent. No, Lewis was a police officer whose reputation preceded his person, a man everyone seemed to distrust and avoid on the streets. He was one of those who believed themselves to be invincible, whose arrogance fueled every interaction, whether professional or personal. He seemed like a man who thought his badge, his position, entitled him to everything. The law was a question of perspective for him, a perspective that he drew according to his moods and his prejudices. Lewis had always been extremely respected by his colleagues, but his methods and judgments were far from exemplary. He did not believe in equal treatment. In Lewis's eyes, an invisible hierarchy existed, based on skin color, status, and authority. It only took one glance for him to judge someone, without knowing their history, without caring about the truth. And this look, this hasty judgment, stopped on Maya as soon as it crossed her path. A look that didn't need words to make it clear that he saw in her not a professional, but a person to be subordinated. A being who did not correspond to the image he had formed of authority. He approached her, his haughty demeanor and abrupt gestures announcing a confrontation. "Do you have a problem, ma'am?" he said sharply, as if the question was not even intended to elicit an answer, but to impose an affront. Maya, without letting herself be destabilized, silently observed the man. She knew she was both an easy target and a difficult opponent to understand. Her appearance, a black woman dressed in her FBI agent uniform, was enough to put Lewis in authority mode. He thought, perhaps unconsciously, that the world belonged to him, and that he could humiliate someone he considered inferior without consequence. But Maya wasn't there to play the roles he assigned her. In a calm, almost detached voice, she replied, "I'm on a mission." It was simple. No need for display, no need for justification. It was a fact. This seemed to bother Lewis, as if the fact that Maya was a black woman, dressed in her FBI agent uniform, challenged the established order in his mind. The image he had formed of power, of authority, of the police institution, was threatened by his presence. He couldn't stand the idea that someone like her could stand on the same stage as him, that a black woman, armed with her badge, could not only exist in this space, but exercise such assertive authority. In his mind, this moment of confrontation violated every unwritten rule he had established for feeling superior, and he wasn't going to let it go. Without warning, as if he was not even aware of the seriousness of his act, Lewis approached her with heavy steps, determined to make her feel his supposed superiority. He stopped right in front of her, his gaze defiant, his attitude implacable. "I don't like being ignored by strangers. You're not supposed to be here," he said menacingly, his voice vibrating with contempt. These words were like discharges of electricity charged with all the symbolic violence that he thought he could exert on Maya, as if her skin color and her uniform made her invisible, as if it were legitimate to humiliate her, to dominate her. But Maya, already accustomed to these invisible confrontations, these small daily humiliations in a system where skin color and gender had to be constantly proven to obtain respect, chose not to respond to the provocation. She had no intention of engaging in a verbal sparring match. Her mission that day was not to make her understand her place in the social order, but to stay focused. Yet she felt the tension rising, the weight of injustice palpable in the air. She knew that Lewis felt superior, that he believed that his position as a police officer gave him the power to control everything. But what he didn't know was that Maya not only had the experience, but also the agility and discipline of a seasoned professional. Maya tried once again to remain calm, not to give in to the anger that was slowly bubbling under her skin. But she didn't expect him to make such a sudden, hasty movement. For no apparent reason, like an uncontrollable explosion of frustration, he raised his hand, determined to strike her. This gesture, this simple movement, revealed everything he thought he could obtain through his status, his badge, and the violence he believed he could impose without consequences. He believed that because of his position of power, he could abuse his position to intimidate this woman, to force her to submit to his idea of authority. But he had underestimated Maya's strength and discipline. Maintaining impressive composure, Maya dodged his blow with the fluidity of a dancer, almost imperceptibly, as if this movement was a part of herself, a natural extension of her perfectly trained body. In a split second, she toppled Lewis to the ground, using the strength and precision of her grip to neutralize him. His arm suddenly found itself behind his back, folded in a movement as controlled as it was efficient. Lewis, completely caught off guard, desperately tried to free himself, but he had no luck. Maya's speed, flexibility, and mastery were far superior to her brutality. The contrast was stark. Lewis, the arrogant man who thought he could exert violence on her, now found himself in a position of total vulnerability, on the ground, shame flashing across his face. The witnesses, shocked but fascinated, began to film the scene, some murmuring and whispering among themselves, others silent, stunned by what they were seeing. It was a sight few expected to experience, let alone film. Maya had not acted out of anger or a desire for revenge. She had acted on pure instinct, a professional reaction dictated by years of training, by an education in discipline and self-control that had led her to this precise moment. There was nothing personal in his response. She did not allow herself the luxury of giving in to the temptation of revenge. She was content to respond to the aggression with force, and this, with undeniable effectiveness. Lewis's gaze, a second before full of arrogance, was now that of a destabilized man. The reality of the situation had just exploded in his face. Maya was not the fragile creature he thought he could humiliate. She was not the one he could dominate with his posture, his violence, and his hierarchy. Maya was an FBI agent, trained, experienced, and above all, untouchable in her professionalism. Maya leaned in slightly, her face impassive, but her gaze as hard as steel. "I advise you to remain calm," she said in a soft but firm, almost icy voice, holding Lewis down. It was not a threat, but a clear warning. She showed him her badge with calculated slowness, as if to ensure that he could never forget who she was, and what she stood for. Maya's voice, once calm and collected, became more authoritative. "I am an FBI agent. You made a serious mistake, and you will be held accountable for it. There will be consequences." Lewis, still on the ground, slowly raised his head, his face marked with anger and embarrassment. Frustration and humiliation mixed in his eyes. He tried to play the victim card, to position himself as the one who had been attacked, as the one who had been caught at fault by a stranger. But the video that revolved around him left no room for interpretation. Every movement, every gesture was documented, recorded, and the truth was there, undeniable. Maya, with a cold gaze, stared at him intensely. "I am going to ask that an investigation be opened against you for this attack. You thought you could hit someone with impunity under the pretext of being a police officer. But that stops here." The scene quickly made the rounds on social networks. The video, which showed the assault of a black female FBI agent by a local police officer, went viral within hours. The comments multiplied, each bringing its share of condemnations and support. Millions of people had seen this shocking moment, and the message was clear. A white police officer had attempted to abuse his power, but a strong and determined black woman had not only defied him, but had unseated him with a skill and finesse he had not anticipated. What could have been a simple isolated incident had turned into a powerful symbol of resistance. This moment had gone beyond the simple confrontation between Maya and Lewis. He embodied the silent struggles that many others experienced, whether on the streets or within the institutions meant to protect them. The incident became a media sensation. In the space of a few days, demonstrators flocked to the streets, not only because of what had happened, but also because of the general fed up with the recurring abuses of power within the police. Protest signs brandished messages like, "Justice for Maya," and "Police serving the people, not their interests." Crowds gathered, demanding accountability, not just for Maya's assault, but for an entire system that seemed to thrive on silent abuse. What began as a simple altercation on a quiet street was now a national movement, a call for justice for black women, for victims of police abuse, for those who for too long had been ignored and oppressed. But it wasn't just a story of confrontation. What happened next was much deeper. The local commissioner, trapped between the reputation of his department and the scale of the affair, was forced to react. The public pressure was enormous. Political figures, activists, and even ordinary citizens were demanding action against Officer Lewis. An official investigation was launched against him for abuse of power, attempted violence, and for acting contrary to the values supposed to guide law enforcement. The affair extended well beyond the simple arrest. It became a national conversation about police brutality, systemic racism, and the treatment of black women in law enforcement. The media, especially television channels, devoted entire programs to examining what was happening behind the scenes of justice, and how some police officers felt untouchable. Maya, for her part, had no intention of letting this incident be reduced to mere personal revenge. She knew that this event, as damning as it was for Lewis, represented a much larger systemic problem. Problems of institutional racism and sexism in law enforcement were not new. They were deeply embedded in social and political structures. But that day, she became its symbol. Maya knew it was not just a matter of justice for herself, but a matter of justice for all the people who were suffering under the weight of an unjust system. What she experienced with Lewis was more than a personal altercation. It was a reflection of a reality shared by countless others. As the days passed, and the media pressure continued to grow, Maya spoke out publicly, knowing that the time had come to take this fight well beyond her own wounds. At a press conference, she denounced not only Officer Lewis' behavior, but also the justice system that allowed men like him to continue to abuse their authority without consequence. "It's not just a question of justice for me," she says in a firm and emotional voice. "It's a question of justice for all women, for all people who suffer violence without being able to defend themselves. And it's time for that to change." His words resonated deeply in the hearts of many listeners, transcending the simple court case to become a cry from the heart for equality, fairness, and dignity. Officer Lewis was suspended, then fired after a lengthy investigation. The system finally seemed to recognize the seriousness of his behavior, although action was slow, as is often the case in these situations. But it was not so much Lewis's defeat that marked a turning point, but the fact that what had started as a violent altercation on the sidewalks of a quiet neighborhood had transformed into a collective awakening. Maya, at the heart of this battle for justice, became a symbol of resistance and dignity. She was more than a victim. She was a voice that carried the hope of many others. She had not only defended her honor, but that of everyone who had been lost in the system. What had been a simple assault by a police officer had become a seminal moment in the fight for racial justice and gender equality. It was a call to action for everyone to become aware of the injustices that play out in the shadows, far from the spotlight. This was not an isolated story, but an example of what millions of people in similar situations experience, people invisible to the authorities. Thus, the story of Maya Williams was not only that of a woman who had faced the injustice of a police officer, but that of an FBI agent who, despite the obstacles, had chosen to defend herself, to stand up and fight for the truth to be heard. She had chosen to fight for a future where such injustices would no longer be tolerated, and a truth that would inspire generations to come. She knew that each victory, each step forward, was a step closer to creating a more just future, not only for her, but for all those, like her, who refused to be oppressed by a system that considered them inferior. And even after the ordeal, Maya continued her work with more fervor, knowing that each battle won, each word spoken, was another stone in the construction of a more just and egalitarian society. Because she knew that true victory did not lie in revenge, but in the profound change that she inspired, and which would, slowly but surely, transform the world around her.